The session's titled, Can Neuroparenting Save the Family? So my name's Dr. Ellie Lee. I'm an academic based at the University of Kent. One of the things I do there is run a research centre called the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. We've had the privilege over several years of being a partner for the Battle of Ideas and programming discussions about issues relating to family life. And I'm delighted that we were given the opportunity to do that again this year. So it's in that capacity that I'm chairing the discussion, having programmed this one. I'm going to first of all introduce our panel. So over here to my right, she's still a registered social worker and originally worked for 12 years as a practitioner. So she's worked for a long time previously in service provision in statutory children's services, but now works as an academic with a background in sociology. She's researched and written a lot of different things relating to family life and social work practice. She's also active in committees and parliamentary work and statutory work. You might be interested to know that in 2009 she served on the social work task force and subsequently the social work reform board, and also on a very important piece of work, which was the Monroe Review of Child Protection in England, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. In terms of her research at the moment, she's conducting international research on social workers' understanding of family complexity, so presumably that's a comparative study. But also people will be interested to know that she's been looking at epigenetics and the impact of technological biology on social policy and public discourse, which is a big overlap with the interests of our research centre and this discussion that we're going to have today specifically. And Sue just told me that the book that she's written with her co-author Dave Walstall is just coming out. Just
called Blinded by Science, so you can imagine the gist of it.
Secondly, I'd like to introduce Tim Loughton MP, the Member of Parliament for East Worthing and Shoreham. I'm sure that plenty of you have heard of Tim, seen him commenting. First elected to Parliament in 1997, so he's been around in Parliament for quite some time, and re-elected in 2001, 2005, 2010 and most recently 2015, each time with an increased majority. For the purposes of the discussion and the reason why we were completely delighted that Tim said he would join this panel was that he was appointed Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Children and Families following the 2010 general election. And that was a position he held until 2012. More recently, he's worked on several parliamentary committees, and the one that's of most relevance for this discussion is that he is the chair of the all-party group for conception to age 2, also called the first 1001 days. And that, probably more than anything, is the reason for being very pleased that Tim's joined us today to have the discussion. The way it's going to work is that Sue, followed by Tim, are both going to give responses to an introduction first from my colleague, Dr. Jan Macvarish. Jan is my colleague at the University of Kent. We've worked together over many years on a range of different projects. One of them was a project called the Uses and Abuses of Biology. Through that project, we looked at the way in which claims about neuroscience had increasingly come to feature in social policy and family policy. And that was a piece of research funded by an organisation called the Templeton Foundation, so we'd like to thank them. What Jan has done is gone on and pursued and developed the ideas that emerged from that piece of research to a book which has just been published. It's called Neuroparenting. The subtitle is The Expert Invasion of Family Life, which obviously tells you something quite clear about Jan's view on what it is that's going on at the moment. So what Jan's going to do is to do her introduction, then I'm going to turn to Sue and Tim to give some responses. Jan.
I want to really start with the backdrop, really, I suppose, which is, I think in the last 20 years, in fact, the time in which Tim's been an MP, although I'm not going to hold him responsible, we've moved from the idea that the family as an institution is under attack from the outside by the few who challenge the particular traditional family form, by people who would be gay parents, by single mothers, by those who reject the very idea of having children, for example. We've moved from that idea of a majority family practice under attack from a small minority to the idea that no family can be relied upon to raise children, even at the most basic level. And that might sound an exaggeration, but I'm hoping that by giving examples in my introduction that you will you will come to agree that actually we've really gone a very, very long way in that space of 20 years. And that since the idea of parenting has become a thing, which it didn't used to be, we didn't used to have that word, we didn't used to use that word, arguably people still don't use that word to talk about their own families. Since the idea of parenting has entered the policy lexicon, it's been inextricably connected to the idea of a parenting deficit. We only start to talk about parenting when there comes to be a very strong idea that somehow we're getting it wrong. And it's, as I said, I think it's very difficult to exaggerate the scale and depth of the entrenchment of that view of a parenting deficit in policy circles. And that, I think, as a backdrop, is how we can explain the fact that by January this year, just as I was finishing off the book, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, made a speech about life chances, which is about social mobility, in which he focused on supposedly new evidence from neuroscience that what parents need to do is engage in baby talk, to make silly faces, and to chatter even when they know the baby can't answer back. That's a pretty extraordinary thing for the Prime Minister of this country to be making a point of stating. Why does he say that? Well, it's because he thinks that mums and dads literally build babies' brains. And this is what I call neuroparenting. The claim or the belief, and it is just a claim, it is just a belief, that parents are the architects of their babies' brains, and therefore that they're the primary determinants of their children's future health, wealth, and happiness, is the thing that's taken hold across policy domains. And what neuroparenting is, I think, is the brainified form of a much longer standing belief, really, in the idea of infant determinism, the idea that our earliest years of life last forever. That's how we're made, which really is an impossible thing to dispute or prove. I mean, I don't know. I know I wasn't breastfed. I've got no idea how often my mother looked into my eyes. I don't know if she chatted to me. I assume she did because she was a normal human being. The idea that infant determinism is actually something even more concrete, this thing called parental determinism, is something that's really taken shape and developed through the 20th century to the 21st. Had David Cameron and the policymakers who've been strengthening this view within policy circles and taking it out over the past 10 years or so, had they consulted a range of actual evidence, had they consulted and bothered to read actual neuroscientists, child development specialists, they would have seen the very many challenges that have been made to the claims of parental determinism and infant determinism. Books like this, very easy to get hold of. Some of them have even been referred to and cited in some of the very, very early policy literature, but then they just disappear. And so we have this very simple, and I would say simple-minded, argument that somehow we now know that the only truth that exists about child development is that parents shape children. Parents are the architects of children's brains. Even the most recent book by Alison Gopnik, very popular writer, loads of parents will read this book, and yet policymakers somehow seem to be unable to buy this book and then actually take note of what somebody who's very well qualified to argue. And what she says is that the family, parents, are merely gardeners. They just provide a general space in which children grow. They are not carpenters who mould or shape a particular child. So the brain is plastic, it's true to say, in the sense that it continues to develop post-birth, and it's sensitive to both genes and environment and experience. But that doesn't mean that it needs to necessarily be regarded, therefore, as vulnerable. Plasticity has been interpreted as the only meaning that's given is now vulnerability. That the idea that the brain is sensitive to that which surrounds it somehow makes it inherently vulnerable to that environment. And we don't have to conclude either that the environment, the family, as it's often referred to in these this kind of language, is fundamentally threatening to its normal development. So the leap from the finding of the plastic brain to the idea that parents determine the future adult, but also that they are necessarily inherently a potential threat to normal brain development, is an ideological leap. This doesn't come from evidence at all. Similarly, had policymakers, and David Cameron and I would say probably Tim, had they read some autobiographies, listened to Desert Island Discs, reflected on their own lives, their friends, those of their own offspring, had they considered human history in all its infinite change and variety, they might have concluded that, generally speaking, human adults are pretty good at keeping their children safe, and they're pretty good at raising normally functioning human beings. And that human infants are pretty good at getting adults to take care of them, and they're pretty good at getting them to love them. We have this thing called love. We've been talking about it relatively easily for thousands of years, and yet somehow it now becomes something that's viewed as a special quality that is somehow just beyond our reach. So the idea that babies' brains are incredibly vulnerable and that normal development can only be secured if certain prescribed parental practices are adopted has been rolled out throughout antenatal care, maternity services, health visiting, children's centres, early years care, social workers, the police. As I was fascinated to discover, the police are now being trained in these kinds of ideas about infant brain vulnerability. The idea that babies' brains are incredibly vulnerable and that normal development can only be secured by very prescriptive practices, this is the form it tends to take. The brain apparently needs to be alcohol-free throughout pregnancy and possibly even preconception. The fetal brain needs to have maternal attention paid to it while it's still in utero. The newborn baby must be breastfed exclusively for 6 months. There needs to be skin-to-skin contact post-birth to ensure something called bonding, something called attachment. The need for parents to work on attuning, another new word that we're now having to learn, to attune to their babies by consciously practicing what's called serve and return encounters, introduces a whole new language for talking about baby care, which is something that people, human beings, you only have to imagine any anthropological program or study you've ever read, or any kind of historical study, to think that people have actually figured this stuff out in a way that suits them in different places and at different times. What parents are instructed to do is that they must see themselves as their child's first teacher. They must undertake the task of brain development by making eye contact, by talking, singing, reading, cuddling their infants in a way that is akin to the 5-a-day recommendations about peas and oranges. And this is all in the name of an abstraction called healthy infant brain development or infant mental health. Not maternal ease or a happy family life, not parents being able to survive or to create a loving environment for all of their children, and of meeting the demands of all their children, plus all the other demands that are upon them. This is not family support, it's not child-friendly advice, it's the institutionalisation of the demand that all mothers become intensive mothers. So why is this idea that infancy is a time of high risk of failure, where parents will struggle to do an adequate job, taken hold? And one explanation is that some very loud voices have become very good at making the argument. It doesn't come from nowhere, although there are existing prejudices that we share across society about infant determinism and to an extent parent determinism. The explicit formulation of this argument into a political argument has been made by people like this: Jack Shonkoff from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, Bruce D. Perry, who's a kind of child trauma expert, written books such as The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and then James Heckman, who's neither of those two things, but is an economist, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, is always is the preface. These are figures from the US who have spent a great deal of time and collaborated together in formulating the argument that the only way to achieve social progress, reducing unemployment, increasing social mobility, reducing violence, bringing down rates of mental illness, is to get mothers to listen to the science and to care for their babies in expert advocated ways. And the promise is, which makes it all sound rational, is that this is a way of saving money. And that's the particular Heckman argument. And these political operators and neuroparenting entrepreneurs have gained traction across the English-speaking world and in the world of NGO operations as well. You have Hilary Clinton a number of years ago now advocating a scheme in New York. The poster there says, "Talk to your baby, their brain depends on it." Anytime, anywhere, talking, reading and singing build your baby's brain. This is a message that's coming out from central government. It's being rolled out throughout all the officials who would interact with parents. It's come across to the UK. All of those figures I pointed to earlier have been to the UK and talked to policymakers. Their works are often cited in fact, they're often the only source in a lot of literature in the policy circle over here. These loud voices have been added to by those chasing the gravy train of public funding. It's a cheap shot, but she raised funds on the basis that she said she could treat the damaged brains of teenagers who'd been raised in inner city circumstances, who had dreadful parents. And she sought to raise money for her charity on the basis that investors could buy a synapse at a time or a neuron at a time. And she sent kids off for brain scans, or for certainly brain monitoring, whatever it was, with London universities. Kids in her care were sent for some kind of scans of their brain. It's difficult to know exactly what they did because the findings have never been reported. So this is policy that's based on prejudice, not policy based on evidence. Sometimes it's wackier than others. Andrea Leadsom was ridiculed for saying that we could massage babies' brains, we need to massage babies' brains. She didn't actually say that, I don't think. I wasn't there. I suspect what she actually said was that baby massage is a very good thing for the state to provide. Again, based on no evidence that actually has any impact, other than probably making mothers very anxious that they're not actually touching their baby in the right way until they've gone through the entire baby massage course. These women in Senegal are intervened upon because apparently these women from a particular rural area of Senegal don't believe in looking their babies in the eye. They're taught by an an American NGO, to talk, sing, look their babies in the eye, because the idea this will lift rural Senegalese women out of rural poverty. Somehow this idea there's a magic bullet through maternal-infant contact, which will somehow lift entire societies. Colombian mothers are intervened on, taught to make a very specific toy for their children. The argument being that by opening the mothers up to that instruction and teaching them they must play with their children on the floor with this particular toy, with a very simple message, somehow Colombian society, which has been at war for 50 years, will be lifted into a different economic state. So what's wrong with this? Apart from the fact that it's not science, it's not evidence, I'm less concerned by the abuse of evidence. It's happening across the board. We can have some interesting arguments about where evidence-based policies, what it actually is. But that's not really my objection to it in a way. My objection to it is that the idea that all parents need parent training is what comes out of these particular arguments and this abuse of so-called evidence. So the idea that how mothers and fathers love and care for their babies is the business of the state in all cases, regardless of whether the child or the family is experiencing any actual problems, in advance of there being any exhibited problematic, antisocial, illegal behaviour, is a very, very problematic idea that we should all be very worried about. It treats parents with a profound disrespect. And in so doing, I think, and this is the most important problem with neuroparenting, is that it actually undermines their ability to be parents. And to be parents of the kind that we need them to be. That is, adults who take responsibility for their children because they have brought them into the world. And because they love them more than anybody else loves them. So the idea that if you look at policy talk, parents are actually talked about as rats. We're likened to rats who don't lick their puppies enough and therefore make the puppies aggressive. We're talked of as objects who engage in behaviours. We'll be subjected to interventions, to treatments. This is the kind of language that's used throughout the policy discourse in this area. We're assessed, we're monitored, we're reported on in the name of safeguarding and preventing costs, future expenditure for the state, and identifying problems before we're even aware as parents that they are occurring. And it places the abstract idea of the science, the brain, in a position of apparently neutral authority above that of the parent. And it actually, I think what it does is it opens the door of the home to the so-called expert interpreter of science, the health visitor who's had a one-day training course on brain science, the policeman who's had 2 or 3 days on early intervention and the evidence and science for cost saving. The health visitor who is taught that she must introduce the baby to the parent. She must introduce the parent to the idea that they have a social baby. These are the kind of programs that parents are being subjected to. They must teach the parent to interpret the baby's needs and to coach the parent in responding on a recommended serve and return basis. It's all very vague. There's no quantities put on this, well, apart maybe from 5 to Thrive. But it's vague enough for it to insert itself into our ways of thinking and sound a bit like common sense, because in a way it's based on what we already do. But it does it in such a way that it deauthorises parents from doing that spontaneously. It must be something that is officially advocated and that must be somehow measured in some kind of outcome, nominally the child's brain, in the future. So why does this damage family life? I spoke about my book to an audience of teachers recently, and I had 2 responses. One was from fathers who were teachers who came to me afterwards and said, "What can I tell my wife? She's on maternity leave and she is eating herself up with worry. She's about to go back to work and she's terrified that who is going to do this intensive motherhood in the nursery? But she wants to go back to work, and we both need her to go back to work. What can I tell my wife?" Her friends are unable to support her because they're all equally anxious. The other response was from a number of teachers who said, "What do we say to parents when they come to us and say, what should I be doing with my child?" Now that should ring alarm bells to all of us. Teachers have a job, they have a job within the confines of the school. The idea that parents are coming to them and saying, "How can I get my child to be school ready? What do you want me to do with my child?" before they reach you. And then finally, what happens as a mother if you do have a drink, if you do use formula, if you feel more repulsed by your newborn or pissed off by pregnancy than overwhelmed with love for your bump or your newborn baby? What happens if your baby goes into intensive care, or you're too sore or exhausted to have the newborn on your chest for that skin-to-skin contact? What happens if you don't immediately fall in love with your child, or your baby seems pretty indifferent to you? How much talking, singing, reading, cuddling is enough? The implication here is that there's somehow a target that could be met. So the answer to the question, can neuroparenting save family life, I think you probably gathered is a no. And in fact, I would say it's a major threat to what's left of family privacy and parental autonomy, because it's bad enough that mothers spend time worrying about the number of peas and oranges they've got their children to ingest on a daily basis, somehow thinking that the NHS can tell them what the right components of a plate should be, without them also worrying that they haven't met their daily target of smiles, stories, songs and cuddles. Thank you.
I agree with virtually everything that Jan has just said. There are particular concerns about the extrapolation of these understandings from a notion of early help, early intervention, and into diagnosis of kind of pathological family life. And as Ellie said, I have a background as a practitioner and manager in children's social care, so I've certainly met lots of children whose needs are not being met. And that aspect of state intervention is, there are big debates about when and where the state should intervene. There are some situations where there is a pretty strong consensus that something must be done. But these ideas have powerfully entered ordinary conversation in children's social care, in health visiting, and the child is now absolutely precariously normal. There is this danger that something will not be properly executed. Jan's mentioned the key players from the States, and there has been a campaign to translate so-called findings from neuroscience for a policy audience, and my goodness, has it worked. It involved a 10-year relationship with a public relations company to create concepts like serve and return and toxic stress. Proper neuroscience, the sort of lab-based neuroscience, doesn't really look like that. It involves an awful lot of rats, and I know a great deal, I've just finished this book about the ecology of the rat lab, and there is a great leap from rat lab to housing estate, which is massaged away. I've given one small example of a rat experiment. Rat mothers given birth, they want to stress the rat mother in order to see what impact it has, so they take away a nesting material. Her parenting behaviour, I'm doing it now, her mothering after that is described explicitly as abusive because she's getting herself rather worked up and she's stamping on her pups and so on. And then it is argued that these pups go on to be poor mothers themselves. The answer, and this is crucial, is that they will reverse the methylation, which is an epigenetic concept that has taken place in these abused pups, with a drug. So apart from the fact that there is an extrapolation from extreme clinical populations and really quite torture of rat labs to human subjects, where it will lead in its benign intention is likely to be pharmacological in nature. So what sounds like a good idea when you're campaigning for resources, and I'm sure that this is Tim's and other people's intention in Parliament, what sounds like a good idea when you're saying, please, this is a really important thing, we need resources, we need to focus on the early years, it has unintended consequences in other places. And just two final points. One is that the effect sizes for a lot of these parenting programmes are really quite modest, and they tend to be transient. There are loads of them, hundreds of these programmes. The evaluations inevitably conclude, oh well, there are some effects, but what we need are more evaluations. So it's an enormous industry of parenting programmes and evaluating parenting programmes. Everybody means well, but this is the benign, smiling face of reproductive engineering, I'm afraid. And that needs a moral debate, and it doesn't need to be shrouded in pseudo-scientific concepts that are packaged to persuade. Okay, thank you.
Well, let me give a couple of disclaimers first of all. I have no clinical qualifications whatsoever. I'm just a jobbing politician, and my training is in Mesopotamian archaeology. So I'm the only one who's actually quite useful being a politician. It's not so useful looking at neuroscience. But I also don't have a book that I've written and trying to sell either. But one of the things I've become very involved with in my time as children's minister and since is the whole area of attachment science, and particularly the 1001 critical days. So, as Ellie said, we have a very strong and very cross-party group on the 1001 critical days. And I also chair the Parent and Infant Partnership charity PIP, where we have 7 PIP projects around the country, actually putting that into practice and giving access to services for parents where there's attachment dysfunction problems with children. So I come at it as an amateur, but I've seen it work in practice for people around the country whose relationships with their children certainly needed assistance. So the way that Jan paints it, it's all terribly black and white, and no doubt it was intended to be painted so. So when we talk about that no family can be relied on to raise children, when we start likening parents to rats, and when we say that parents are being subjected to programmes forcing all this dubious science, that's not the case. These are options. These are access to services which are available in some parts of the country, not in others, for parents who may need it, particularly women suffering from perinatal mental health problems, which is a big issue. Now, I come at it actually from a similar point of view as Jan anyway. I have always been one that thinks parents know better than the state. I think, and I've argued over many years, that the pendulum has swung far too much from the parent to the state, that we have parents living in fear of the obesity police or the snacking police knocking on their door if they don't follow various instructions from government or whatever. And for some parents, that's actually completely undermined their confidence in being able to get on with the natural job of bringing up their kids to the best of their ability. And if we look at the record of kids who go into the care system, become the direct responsibility of the state, despite a whole lot of things going in the last few years, that record is still pretty lousy and needs to improve. So of course the first port of call must be with the parents of that child. But I just want to flag up a couple of problems, and this is what 1001 Critical Days is really all about, that perinatal mental health problems are increasingly common. Something like 20% of women at some time during or after their pregnancy will suffer from mental health problems. And yet about half of all cases of perinatal depression, the most common, and anxiety, go undetected. And many of those which are detected then fail to get properly looked after. So it is a big problem, and a happy parent is more likely to make for a happy baby growing up as a happy child. And the fact is at the moment that we have something like 1 million children in this country who suffer from the types of problems, ADHD, conduct disorder, etc., that are increased by problems with antenatal depression, anxiety and stress. So regardless of what parenting programmes may be shoved in their direction, we have a problem with women who have perinatal mental health problems, and that is impacting on their children. I will go along with the science that says it impacts on their children both in the womb and afterwards. And there's clear links, and there are reliable studies that show that a child at 16 who is suffering from depression is almost certainly likely to have been the child of a mum who suffered from some form of perinatal depression as well. So the influences on the child in those first 1001 days are absolutely considerable, and we can go into the technicalities of which all the people with titles on this desk are far more qualified than me about exactly the impact that it has on the development of the brain in those early days. So I don't want to make this a black and white argument. I want to say there are different ways of helping parents. We have got a problem with parents, particularly with perinatal mental illness, and we don't have the services available to help them. It's not being forced on them. Nobody's having a manual of attachment science thrust into their hands as a mum and dad desperately trying to do the best thing for their children. But there is a growing body of people who feel that those initial 3 years are absolutely crucial. So this is not about supplanting parents, and I think the attitude in the past has been too much about supplanting parents. It is about supporting parents. And the big effects of perinatal mental illness and the big costs, if we look at it in financial terms, obviously social terms are crucial, but the financial effects of not getting perinatal mental illness right is something like £8 billion as the Maternal Mental Illness Alliance produced a couple of years ago in that really important study. So I'm partly agreeing that we do too much to put pressure on parents. That's the fault of government, that's the fault of society in general, it's the fault of corporations, that what is the perfect mum or dad, and we must rely on parents and their instincts. But some of those parents are unable to bond properly and offer the best possible parenting to those children for all sorts of problems, and for them we need to recognise that, and we need to be able to offer help. And that's why attachment, that's why having the PIP projects around the country, which we want to roll out in every part of the country, are there to provide that crucial assistance for a mum in particular who's had a perinatal mental health problem, and including dads wherever possible as well. So let's not make this a black and white argument, is what I'm saying. I think some of the things the government have done, some things that are available now, are some of the solutions, but never should they be portrayed in terms of this is how the state thinks you should bring up your baby, and therefore that's the way you will bring up your baby. That's not the way it works.
Thanks, Tim. The room's so full now, I'm actually going to come straight out in a second, but what's been said so far, I just want to completely abuse my position of chair and ask a couple of questions myself, which you may or may not want to come back on. One issue I think is interesting is Tim's contention that in relation to a distinct new problem of childhood, we have a clear increased incidence of childhood mental ill health in the form of ADHD and childhood depression, and that those problems are simply increasing. We know they are, we can measure them. I wouldn't mind knowing what people think about that, because from a lot of the sociology I read, there is a lot of argument about what's going on in terms of understandings of children and their responses to life, and whether or not there's a lot of sociology which basically says we are over-medicalising and over-pathologising childhood experience, and that, for example, the increased incidence of childhood depression is a manifestation of that, a pathologisation of the normal ups and downs of childhood. So I'm interested in that, what people think about that, and then I'm also interested in other people's thoughts on whether they go along with the idea that those childhood experiences can be derived back in their root to the emotional state of the mother. Is that how you would want to think about it also? The second question, which I would like you all to comment on, is this term that's in the beginning, in the title of your report, critical. Now, critical in neuroscience, critical means something specific if you're a neuroscientist. And I don't think a neuroscientist would ever say that 1001 days are critical. I think that would be too long a time. Anyway, I'm just interested in what any of you think about that and the use of a term which in my understanding is specific in neuroscience and how it's then come to appear in the title of your report. And that's mostly for you, Tim, but I'm interested in both of your thoughts as well. Right.
Well, I thought it was an interesting question that you threw out there, Ellie, about how do we know that more mothers are depressed. And it reminded me because Jerome Kagan, whose book was up there, has written a book which is about the crisis in the profession of psychology. And in it he uses an example where he describes the behavior, where there's a person who is compulsively repeating an action over and over again and absolutely cannot resist doing it. And you go through it, and of course you're thinking, oh, maybe they have a obsessive compulsive disorder. And at the end of it, he says, this is what everyone I know does with their phone, which is, they're there, they're checking it constantly, they're looking, they're going back and forth, they're losing track of time. And so it seems to me that a lot of this is how we frame the question. So I think that, if we frame it in terms of depression, then of course, that's what we're going to find. And so that was the thought of that. And then just briefly, I wondered if the panel could talk a little bit about the unintended consequences of presenting children's brains as vulnerable, because it seems to me that one of the problems with parenting now, or the whole parenting paradigm, is the idea that children are very, very vulnerable and you need to protect them. And what it seems to me is that instead of teaching children to how the world works and how to find their place in it, what is happening now is that parents see their job as protecting their kids from the world. Well, they're not doing what they should be doing, I think.
Really, my biggest issue in neuroparenting is this whole, as you mentioned, critical idea, the idea that early life is the most important thing. And I feel like it's really quite unfounded, because one of the largest arguments for it is, of course, neuroplasticity, which is a lifelong ability. People with OCD in their 30s onwards are able to completely reorganise their brains, get rid of their OCD effectively. And so I don't see how that in any way suggests that early life is more important. And then the responding argument is neurogenesis. It's like in early years, you're still formulating, creating, producing more grey matter. That happens in early years, not in the rest of your life. You go, great, it also happens when you're 11. Well, not just 11, like early teens. You wouldn't look at early teens and look at parents and judge whether they're successful parents based upon their brain activity. You wouldn't go, oh yeah, look how much activity there is. Their parents must be successful. You look at early teens and you go, the parents are successful if their children are happy, or if their children are benefiting from their parents in any manner. And so I feel like it's ridiculous, again, to go, the early years matter when everything that happens in the early years can be redone by a single individual's willpower. And it's also ridiculous when you can't hold to that standard later in life and go, yeah, this is what matters. Matters is being able to make a brain function properly. Surely what should matter, surely there should be more respect for the children and going, actually, it doesn't really matter if their brain is of high activity or matters whether they're happy or not. I feel like this misses the point of parenting completely.
You've made a compelling case that we should all be worried about a case where we're pumping children full of drugs and the pressures of women. But I wonder, how do we exercise responsible skepticism when we don't have a world where people are so mistrustful of excellence? We go to a point where parents believe that certain vaccines cause autism, or people just reject anything that comes from an expert or a scientist just because they've heard that in the past scientists have been overstating claims such as neuroparenting.
So is there genuine expertise that we should believe in?
How do we have a responsible argument when people just don't carte blanche reject every study, every book as driven?
Got it.
I think it's a little bit disingenuous to claim that these parenting programmes are completely optional and at the same time say that there are such high rates of mental ill health among mothers nowadays, because it's precisely that climate where all mothers come to see themselves as being mentally vulnerable. The very fact of having had a baby, creating that condition of mental vulnerability, and in a way to not label yourself as being mentally vulnerable in and of itself becomes a marker for being mentally vulnerable and therefore in need of a particular programme. So I'm thinking, for example, when I had a baby and the health visitor comes around with a questionnaire, and I'm sure it's changed and I'm sure things are far more sophisticated nowadays, but I was given a typed out questionnaire with questions such as, have you cried in the past week? And, probably terrible confession here, but that's probably most weeks, irrespective of whether I've had a baby or not, nothing whatsoever to do with that. But actually it was a colleague at work told me, if you answer no to all the questions, then they're going to think you're lying, and then they will think that you have actually got a problem. So the best thing to do is to put 2 or 3 yeses, and then you look normal. So you can go into answering these questions completely with that mindset, what is the right answer to do? Anyway, so the bigger point I wanted to make was that I think, but when these interventions fall into this climate where Ellie pointed out, children are being labelled, you've got the kind of medicalisation, the pathologisation of normal experiences. Latest NUS survey suggested that nearly 80% of students now label themselves as suffering from some kind of mental illness. And I think that's the absolute tragedy in all of this, and I think these interventions into parenthood are only going to make this worse, not better.
So that questionnaire that was mentioned there is called the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, which other people may know about. I haven't done any research about it for a while, but when I last did, one of the things that was interesting about it is that even though it was being used, very widely used, it was completely routine, it had actually been rejected as an instrument by the National Screening Committee. I don't know if this has changed, on the grounds that it was unable to accurately assess. So it would generate an unwarrantedly high level of false positives, people like you, that would fail to identify women who are clinically depressed, because clinically depressed people don't typically say the sort, they don't do what you do.
I'm interested in a little bit more about the kind of uncritical appetite for this kind of stuff. I work in a profession, community work, youth work, which used to be quite a radical profession. And a lot of my colleagues now and people I manage go on these kind of 1 day, 2 day, maybe even a 5-day course, which gives them a kind of an evangelical experience of something which is quite a kind of nuanced and complex and deep subject, even if we disagree with the content and the outcomes of that subject, there's an awful lot to understand there. But they get this kind of 1 day, 2 day, 3 day experience of it, and they come back full of it, and they're desperate to kind of rush out to their families and kind of implement it in quite an evangelical way. And there seems to be a complete suspension of any critical faculties by professionals in this. You know, I'm almost reluctant to call my colleagues professionals anymore in that kind of context. And this is from a profession that used to be a radical profession that was looking at, which was rooted in understanding learners as having agency and self-control and self-determination. And now they just want to go out and do things. There's one called the Solihull approach and all that, and it just kills me. And I just kind of wondered if you've done any work on these kind of courses and their level of substance, which allows people to come back in this evangelical frame of mind.
So your point is that this is diminishing professions?
It diminishes professions. It's also, they seem to come back with a confidence about their level of understanding, which they seem to have suspended their critical faculties.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the model that Jan's talking about seems to me to be pathological in terms of it's a kind of pathological abstraction from any kind of human relation. The idea that parenting is a discharging of services in relation to a brain. You know, it's just kind of, look at a picture of Madonna and child. It's a human relation. It's the gaze, tenderness, and those sorts of things. But the idea that as mother you're discharging services, which I think does obstruct otherwise normal relations. Anyone who, I mean, myself, my friends have very negative experiences of childbirth, and that's because if childbirth is hard, then essentially you feel that if you haven't done skin to skin and breastfeeding, then actually it obstructs the relation because everyone's telling you this is what you have to do to have the relation. But I mean, I think also it can lead to a certain fakeness in motherhood. You know, I am cuddling my child, I am playing with my child, I am smiling with my child. There's a kind of, you do things in inverted commas, which means you're not actually relating to the child, you're discharging services through an idea of what must be done. And actually that's kind of very artificial. And you see that actually, I'm sure Tim's right in terms of it not being state indoctrination, but you would see that in any kind of various, any middle class playground. You see that, it's just like, just talk normally. Personally, I'm really glad that my first 1,000 days of my son are over because, you know, it's actually quite a boring time. And by the age of, it's only when they get to 3 that you can start to discipline, to talk, to engage. And actually that's when the relation starts. Actually before 3, and everyone says this, your mum says it basically to get through the first 3 years. You know, so there is a kind of, and the first 3 years are really boring, and then actually they're a person. And I think that problems of behaviour and ADHD and all that sort of thing, that starts at 3, or it starts when children can actually be engaged with as social beings and not just as a bundle of needs.
I've read Jan's book, I just want to reiterate, excellent book, genuine expertise. Continued celebration. Sue White has written the best paper on early intervention as well. I'd strongly recommend if you can access it, to read that. And I want to push this on early intervention. I wondered if any of you could elaborate a little bit more on this thing, early intervention. And you look at domestic violence, and they're talking about changing the laws there as well to have early intervention. And it seems to be, as Simon says, there is a zeal for early intervention, especially for sort of welfare professionals. Most people start to become kind of well-being professionals. And there is a genuine zeal. So I'm interested at a kind of broader level what this early intervention thing is all about. So I just thought I'd sort it out. And as Tim's here, just bravely coming along here, I think, and standing his ground, I never thought I'd say this, but I want to appeal to your conservative instincts.
Yes.
And you're saying some parents, but the leader, or the ex-leader of the government, David Cameron, promoted parenting classes as something that should be aspirational for everybody. Surely you can see that family autonomy and the authority of parents is essential, and there is a problem here with what you're doing.
I just want to pick up 2 things. One about the idea that you're just talking about early intervention,
and it's Stuart's point that what we're actually seeing isn't just early intervention in babies, we're seeing psychological and emotional interventions now at all stages of people's lives, from childhood all the way through to university students. And the figures that are bandied around, 20% of mothers will suffer from mental health problems. We've also got massive concept creep, and people in the audience do this as well. So they'll elide mental illness with mental health problems. They'll elide disorders with mental health problems. And these same figures are being used about everybody, not just babies and their mothers, but young children in schools, students in universities. And paralleling what we call the neuro-entrepreneurs, we've got a massive unevaluated industry of everything from mindfulness to positive psychology to neuro-linguistic programming in a sort of mad market that goes from early years settings all the way through to universities. No evidence whatsoever, completely unevaluated. And one of the effects, and I think we've heard a smidge of it today, is this constant neurotic priming, the idea that it's not just mothers and babies, we're all mentally unwell in some way and we need state intervention. It might be being carried out by all sorts of snake oil merchants and therapeutic entrepreneurs, but the public purse is funding it all. And it's all about training us to have appropriate emotional responses, appropriate mindsets, appropriate emotional and psychological skills. So I think that the neuroscience is one problem, but it's not the only problem. And it parallels this massive sort of cultural psychologizing of absolutely everything about us and our emotional lives that's quite pernicious.
I'm going to bring the panel back in. Tim.
Blimey. Well, you won't like me even more because I chair the parliamentary mindfulness group as well. And so far 170 MPs and members of the House of Lords have been, including me, have been through a mindfulness course. And the calmness of heckling has certainly been noticeable in the chamber, so I wouldn't write it off. You're very welcome to come and join us. Let's take some of them in reverse, and the point over there about domestic violence, then coming on to early intervention. Domestic violence is a case in point. Supposedly, per statistics, a third of all domestic violence starts in pregnancy, extraordinarily. And when I spent a lot of time, as Sue knows, and I asked Sue to be on the Monroe panel and did a lot of good work, I spent a lot of time out with real social workers, which is something that politicians never seem to do, to actually go and spend time with the people that they are there to make regulations about. And I would say that of the cases I came across in those times that I went out, and certainly from experienced social workers, something like 3/4 of safeguarding cases with children had domestic violence at their heart. It is a huge issue, and a huge issue linked to safeguarding, which is why I've got so many children and increasingly coming into the care system. In terms of David Cameron and what he said about parenting, I think he was wrong. I disagree with David Cameron quite a lot. He disagreed with me, which is why I'm no longer the Children's Minister. And, although he's no longer Prime Minister, but that's another matter. But where I think where we're in danger, absolutely right, is trying to, as I said earlier, claim that the state knows how you should be to be a good parent, and this is what you should do, and that compulsion that goes with it. I've nothing against parents going to parenting classes, and we shouldn't stigmatise it. I mean, just as some people go to the gym because it's seen as a good thing because it might make your body fitter physically, why wouldn't you want to become a better parent by getting some advice? Now, what we don't want to do is to make that sound compulsory, that if you don't go to parenting classes, you're a bad parent, and that you should not challenge that advice that you are getting. And parents are different, and children are different. Some things would be more appropriate for others. So what I certainly objected to is this sort of state advice that you must go to a parenting class, and this is where you're going to do it. And if you don't do it like that, you are in some way an inadequate parent and should be made to feel guilty about it, which will lead you to stress, which will lead you to have all sorts of stress problems passed on to your child, which will result in you having mental illness problems and that whole vicious cycle. But the other aspect of this as well, again, from what I saw, is so many parenting problems are intergenerational. And so many problems with families where there's domestic violence, with kids who have to be taken into care. We have an argument about that. It feeds back to parents who had poor parenting, however we want to define that, but parenting problems themselves. And at some stage you have to break into that vicious intergenerational cycle. And I think we've been afraid to do that in the past. I just want to find a balance in all of this between making sure those people who clearly do need some help have access to it without stigmatising all those who don't. And of course, it's not all down to what happens in the womb and what happens in those 1,001 critical days. And I'm not going to some clinical argument about what critical actually means. It's
well, it's the name of your report.
I know. Well, I didn't actually give it that name, but it's certainly got attention, which is good, and there's some good common sense things in that. But there's a whole load of other pressures that are placed on kids these days, and I entirely take up the point, although it's something that Camilla Batman-Gelage, which was a low shot on your slide earlier, was very much pushed that you do have a second chance at mending damaged kids later on. And with all the peer pressures and social media pressures and everything on children, the likes of which we've never had before, there are all sorts of reasons why children will suffer from mental health problems or mental illness itself later on in life. Some of which may relate to their experiences with their parents going back to age 0, and some of which may be societal and environmental later on. And certainly, I think a big worry, and again I've spoken about this on many occasions, is that the response to so much of this has been powerful chemical drugs. And I think the big scandal has been that huge increase in drugs given to kids. Many of them we now know that were inappropriate for kids, but it's in the absence of other more appropriate therapies that might have been the best approach to that child. And early intervention, somebody who defined it, early intervention has never just been about age 0 or right at the beginning of life. Early intervention is about helping a child in particular at a stage before a problem develops into a more serious problem. That's what the Early Intervention Foundation is all about. So you don't just get one chance, or later chances as well.
Can I just ask you though, Tim, do you recognise, so there were several comments down here about the kind of overinflation and flabby use of terminology and conflating all sorts of different experiences together that gets bound up in some of these discussions about mental health and mental illness. Do you recognise that at all, or do you just think there genuinely is this kind of epidemic of depression and ADHD in children?
No, I think it's both. I think there has been an increase in mental illness amongst mothers and amongst children, and I've no doubt about that. There's a new report from the Education Select Committee about mental illness in children. But also, and I think where Jan and I may have something in common here, I was a Shadow Children's Minister from about 2001 until 2010, so I saw all the legislation that came out post-Climbier, of which there was huge amounts, lots of children bills, children adoption bills, children family bills, children's schools and family bills, or whatever. And at the end of it, I think I was complicit in what became almost a state conspiracy, because in the face of horrendous acts like Victoria Climbier and later Baby P, and those high-profile deaths, which were the tip of an iceberg, and I had to, my role as Children's Minister, Monday morning, my first role every week was to go through the list of kids who had been killed at the hands of parents or carers, or was just about to go to court, or a new case had come in, and a pretty gruesome roll call that was every week. But we thought the solution, then it was the Labour government at the time, but we didn't oppose most of it, that the solution was more legislation, was more rules, more guidance, more stuff that social workers had to follow, otherwise they risked being held responsible for another Baby P. And we brought in so much bureaucracy, and that, I think, developed a culture of the state knows best. and if you didn't follow it, then somehow you were anti-children, and that you weren't taking safeguarding issues properly. And it was wrong. And at the end of it, in 2010, there were just as many children, I'm afraid, being killed and harmed at the hands of parents and carers as there were before. We had record numbers of social workers who'd left the profession, who were pulling their hair out because they were having to obey so many rules. And that's why I did two things. My first role as a children minister was, one, to switch off the contact point computer system, which tried to put in place of decent social workers going about a difficult job, having a huge database. You thought you could keep kids safe by having their details on a computer. And secondly, we set up the Monroe Review, which was a radical review, and I think one of the best reviews of the way we look after children in this country, which recommended doing away with a lot of regulation and giving more professional judgment calls back to social workers at the sharp end to be able to judge by spending time face-to-face with the families they were dealing with, rather than 80% of the time in front of computers. And I think that was right. So I railed against the sort of state intervention in child protection to the extent it had come. But still the state has a role in this, but as I said right at the beginning, the pendulum has gone too far and still needs to be wheeled back.
Sue, do you want to make a few comments? I'd be very interested in what you think about this, what I understand is an unprecedented spike in children being taken into care.
Lots of people speculate about why there are unprecedented numbers of children in the care system. I think we'll probably be going off on a bit of a tangent if I start trying to address it, but certainly I think the imperative to prevent is part of that spike, because the biggest spike is in the removal of very small infants and the rise in numbers of children placed for adoption. And that's what I mean about the perniciousness of the kind of utopian fantasy that everybody can be perfected, which comes, it's the dark side of plasticity. You know, if brains are plastic, if genes are plastic and malleable, then should we not be making them better? So what you have is this ever-increasing mandate for people to be made to fix real people. Real people don't exist anymore. You're in some state of, in perfectibility. So I think that does, as Jan said, create new arenas in which people do intervene. And if you've got the resources and the vocabulary to argue back or just lie when people come and ask you questions, which was your point, I would lie too, then you can probably keep people out of your life. But actually, if you are a woman who is experiencing domestic abuse and, hey presto, depressed because of that, then you probably aren't going to be able to do that. And what you're likely to get is the invocation of the child's time scale thrown at you. So we've got to get better quickly because the child can't wait. Now, I'm not saying the child can wait. What I'm saying is that there is an alternative to putting people on franchise programs and treating those programs as if they're a pill. I know people, many families, who've been on 5 of these blessed things, and I'm sure they're very nice for the time that you're there, but there are alternative ways of dealing with these things. And what makes people unhappy? Social isolation, having nowhere to go, nothing to do, crap food. The bloke next door's got a really scary dog, so I'd better get one too. These things require what used to be social interventions. I'm interested in the youth and community work example there, because I just think we have completely forgotten how to appraise what resources there are in communities and trying to get people together to feel that they've got some sort of potency in their life. If people are having difficulties in their relationships, which are resulting in appalling violence, somebody needs to go and have a conversation with them. The woman, the man, somebody needs to do something, not put them on a parenting programme, not turn up as many social workers do in the system that Tim has described and say, do you realise domestic abuse is damaging your children? Well, I think people do know, and that is not helpful. So what we've got is a great big machine which is busily doing things, trying to perfect people, trying to fix them, And actually, nobody's doing the really obvious things. We used to run groups. You know, we used to set up groups in community centres, and women used to come and they used to get to know each other and they used to support each other. Now, you know, obviously there were still problems. Obviously, children still died. But at the moment, we've got a system that is created with the assumption that if social workers don't go round, then the parents are going to kill their children. The reason why most children don't get killed by their parents is not because social workers go around, because most parents don't kill their children. So you don't build a system around that. You build a system around trying to build capacity and trying to have medium-term relationships with people in struggling situations. And at the moment we don't have that, which means if I were a young mother with postnatal depression, I would be frightened of going to my GP because he might share my information. And anybody with any sense would do that.
Okay, well, what I've just written down here is that, first of all, you know, we've had a really quite civilised society with all kinds of horrible things going on in private. It doesn't make society as a whole dysfunctional because there are unresolved conflicts and problems between individual people. And so the idea that the only way in which we can somehow save society or rescue society, that our priority should be turning our attention to the private, I think it just seems to me is a very strange idea. It might sound commendable, and I might sound really horribly hard-hearted. I'm not saying I would like there to continue to be, or there to be an increase in strife in people's private lives. But it is perfectly possible, I think, to have a functioning society that makes stuff, that educates people, that is civilised, generally speaking, with lots of people having had really quite nasty childhoods, because people's brains are not damaged irreparably in a way that makes them non-functioning people by their childhood experiences. We just know this. We know this. Not because of science, but because we mix with human beings who we don't know anything about their childhoods, and they probably don't either. And yet they manage to function in life. Who knows what MPs experience? Who knows what we've experienced? You know, I've got no idea what I experienced 0 to 3. For all I know, you know, in 50 years' time it will be revealed to me that my mother was, you know, sectioned and had postnatal depression. There's no evidence as far as I can tell in me. If I knew that was the case and I absorbed the current messages, I might well think that there must be something wrong with me. So I think there's a massive danger here, and there's a big red herring, I think, with this idea of perinatal mental health. It's a new way of talking about postnatal depression. Perinatal refers to babies. It doesn't refer to women. It refers to babies. It might refer to the general period after birth, but if you talk about perinatal mortality, we don't mean mothers dying, we mean babies. And I think this is another case of language being used in a very confusing way, almost purposefully, because I think the terrain has shifted. There hasn't been a big voluntary take-up of parenting classes, and therefore we have this ramping up of this idea that there is an epidemic of perinatal mental health. And why it's called perinatal mental health is because the baby is therefore brought into the picture in the way that it wasn't before, in this deterministic, inevitable way that somehow if a mother is struggling with early motherhood, the real problem there is the fact that her child, when they're 22, will struggle at university. Well, my concern is for the mother and her struggles at that point in time. And when you speak to mothers and when mothers are studied, one of the solutions is their family members. In fact, it's the most popular solution, is support from family members and from their husband or their partner. It's not from health visitors, because you don't see a health visitor very often, really, for all the kind of increase in number and intervention. It isn't from your GP, although they might be able to medicate and help if it's that extreme. But for most people who experience that kind of period of struggle, they will come through that because their baby will become easier, their families will step up to the plate, and they will become more confident. Now, what makes them unable to become confident? Partly it's that you're told that you've already damaged your baby's brain because you didn't feel that love in the first year. So you might feel completely fine, theoretically, by year 2 of the baby's life, when the baby's much easier. But you now worry, retrospectively, that you've already screwed up that child. How does that help? How does that help people? And, you know, the other side of the kind of the perinatal mental health construction is this idea of infant mental health that's increasingly, this is what's being evangelised about amongst MPs and amongst loads of policymakers and all kinds of practitioners, is this idea that somehow the baby is precarious, as Sue said earlier, this kind of precariously normal. That somehow the natural, normal state of human existence is of being screwed up unless something happens preemptively. That's a major screwed up way of thinking about human society that only takes common sense to figure out that there's a problem there.
Do you not think that the whole notion of, when you're pregnant, I was 15 years ago, and I know how much I was told and how many books I was advised to read and blah, 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 and what I was supposed to do and what would be right for baby. It's a wonder nobody actually gets to the point of being able to give birth without already being mortally depressed about the epic failure that they are about to make. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it seems to me, as an old cynic, that actually what we've managed to do here is to create an environment in which we can identify more and more and more problems so that we can employ more and more people to resolve them. Actually, what it needs is for people to be left to get on, to do what they know how to do, to be actually treated as adults and left alone, and for people to then put the resources to where they are really needed, because I'm not saying that there are not the families that you identify that do need intervention and support, but you are just building bigger and bigger haystacks at this point in time, and it's time it stopped.
Is the issue here not one which is throughout society, that we are sort of infantilising everyone in the country, which means that we now say to parents, well, you don't know how to parent, you should be told by the government a specified way of doing it, which is the only correct way of doing it. And by doing so, is it not just the fact that, we may be then giving them very good advice, but are we not then also meaning that any other ideas that are available for how to parent, things which people might have been previously taught by their own parents, are now actively denigrated, because they are not told these things anymore, and not allowed to object to the sort of perceived or official way of saying these things?
I might take issue with some of Mr. Loughton's points. Every comment starts with a statistic, 10% this, 10% that. Like you, I don't have a scientific background, but it strikes me that you've diagnosed a condition called life. And if you ask a woman who's getting 3 hours sleep and no more, she will probably say yes, she is depressed. And there is genuine depression, it's a genuinely difficult time, and I know. Nevertheless, you then leap into the extremes of Victoria Climbier and Baby P, and you refer to that as the tip of the iceberg, as if everybody is on a sliding scale for this. But these difficulties, they are separately and qualitatively different. But in general terms, I'm quite reassured, because your programme seems to be, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary, but who cares? The worry is that we'll end up in the situation in Scotland, where we have a named adult, as if that person can know any more the life and the workings of the relationship between mother, father, son, child, whatever. It's very vague, and it's totally unscientific.
I just wanted to make a point about making a distinction between two, I think, separate but related, clearly related issues we're talking about, and often muddling the two. And the first is the effects that an individual insult or period of insult on the developing brain can have for a child's development. And then the second is what can stimulation above and beyond what's normal do for improving a child's developing brain. And I think the first is undoubted or unrefuted that there are certain insults to a developing brain which is more vulnerable than an adult brain, that can cause lifelong and permanent neurological changes in that child's brain. And an example would be, we know that children who aren't exposed to language between a certain age will never develop the ability to speak or use language. So there's clearly a permanent and uncorrectable change. The second is if a person is otherwise developing normally, does extra stimulation in some way make them develop better, even just playing Mozart to children, make them more intelligent later on. And I think muddling those two is quite harmful to both sides of the argument in a way, because the role of the state and the role of scientists and doctors and whoever is to identify the things we can avoid in developing a child. That would, specific examples would be like neonatal infections, things like that, that can have very damaging effects. And then the other side is this kind of industry around improving parenting by doing things that are just completely not evidence-based, and there's no proof that they have any positive effect at all. And I think it's quite important to make the distinction between those two things.
Thank you.
I just wondered if Tim thought it would help to make life generally easier for new mothers. I can remember finding the first 6 months of my first child's life really difficult, with a family and a reasonable income and all the rest of it. So perhaps you should be thinking more about more social support, more opportunities to meet other people in the same boat, even architecture which makes it easier for people to get around. All the very small practical things which make mothers feel better and therefore much more able to do the things that they know perfectly well that they should be doing, but find easier to do when they aren't sleep deprived, stressed out, lonely and all the rest of it.
Just quickly on this point about somebody said that it's sort of reassuring that you say that it's not mandatory and that people will be able to choose this and not sort of forcing everybody to be squeezed through the same sausage machine. But then you also say it should be the same as going to the gym. We all want to improve ourselves, and so why wouldn't we want to be better parents? And Cameron said the same thing. He said, we can all use a bit of help sometime. And I think that's kind of quite pernicious because it creates the idea that there is a right answer somewhere. And it is inevitable that the social pressure will be that people should be obliged. It's unavoidable, should be obliged. Not obliged, but the cultural and social pressure that we would somehow want to do this. And I think Sue's point about this obsession with affectability, this idea that there's a right answer, I think that's really what's underpinning this, and that is delusional. I mean, there is no parenting has changed over the millennia and will continue to change. The idea that we know what it is that we want to create, and worse, if you did, then you're stopping social change, you're stopping progress. You're imagining that this is what a person should be, rather than whatever a person is capable of being. So I think we've got a challenge. It's not the same as going to the gym.
I used to be a health visitor, and I really liked the comments that the person at the back made about how essentially professionals have lost their ability to make up their own minds, rather than working to script or to tick box or whatever, to use their discretion, because they know that they're accountable to so many other people in order to come back with and deliver the figures that they know are needed to be centralised to the Department of Health. One thing I learned very early in my career was that parents need privacy in order to develop a relationship with their child. And the more professional supervision that there is during that time, the longer that will take, and the more that mother's confidence in her ability to do the job she wants with the child she loves, that's going to be undermined. So the more professional intervention and interference that there is in family life, the more damaging it is. I think we just have to trust parents.
There's a tendency to separate the 1001 days and the named person scheme in Scotland as though the latter is a more extreme version of the former. I don't see them as that distinct at all. I think they're both quite alarming. I think what they do with 1001 days has this kind of disingenuousness built into it, that after it has elapsed, can the parent suddenly go, I'm over the hump on this, but you're not, because every single time that you feel as though you've run afoul of something that you should have been keeping an eye on, which will happen because that's life, you are going to be made more and more to feel that what you're doing is wrong. So it creates this kind of lifelong dependency on people external to the parent-child relationship to put it right. It should come as no surprise, by the way, and there's been some anger expressed here at the fact that drugs are being, kind of the prescription of certain drugs as quick fixes. That should surprise nobody, when the idea of these problems being only externally validated and solved has already been premised.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. Not only do we get overdiagnosis, but also misdiagnosis. But we don't want to offend professionals or colleagues just in case they got it wrong or us got it wrong. On the other hand, I suspect that there might be cases out there that we fail to detect because they don't reach us for other reasons. So there might be an increase, a genuine increase, not necessarily the one reflected in the figures. A thought on neuroparenting. Yes, it's been touched by several areas. It seems that
I'm really sorry, I've been red carded.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to cut you off there. I'm going to bring our speakers in just for their very last comments. Tim, Sue, Jan, sorry, you've got like 1 point you can make. Anyway, I think we've had a great discussion, even if it's not unresolved.
Okay, I don't know what people are so scared about 1001 Critical Days. It's full of things like every woman with a history of past or present serious mental illness should have access to a consultant perinatal psychiatrist. There should be increased evaluation of services to see what works. Vulnerable families should have access to. This is not prescriptive. This is offering assistance for those who genuinely need it. Just to come back, Scotland named adults, I think, was the most atrocious example of Big Brother. And one of the things that Sue said as well, in relation to the lady back there about filling in the forms, that a mum who has got some sort of perinatal mental illness would be scared to go to the GP. That is the problem at the moment, that the public agencies are seen as the people who can come in and take over your parental role and ultimately take your child into care. We need to see them there as support services who can offer support. And that's the difference between health visitors, which I think is a good thing, who should be welcomed across a threshold, in the way that social workers aren't. Because when a social worker knocks on the door, they're seen as the slippery slope to my child coming into care, and the drawbridge goes up. The point I made about stigma and Jim's and Cameron's comments there is a stigma about going to parenting classes. There is a stigma about going to relate, because you are seen as, rightly or wrongly, in some way failing at your job of being a parent or of being a partner. All I'm saying is, nobody's a perfect parent. God knows what a perfect parent actually is, and we shouldn't try to idealise that or define it. But everybody wants to do the best by their children, and everybody probably could do a little bit better by actually going along and talking to other people and sharing their experiences as well. And the final point is, why do we have this problem in this country and other Anglo-Saxon countries particularly, and they don't have it in some of the Mediterranean countries? Now, if you take the example of Barcelona, when in Barcelona they rebuilt the whole city, what they didn't rebuild was the social structures of families living together. So literally in some cases, parents would live on the ground floor, or grandparents live on the ground floor, parents live on the floor above, and children live above. They talked to each other, they shared those experiences. They didn't therefore need to go to GPs, social workers and others. And that's something that we have, over the years, lost in this country. And that's why it comes back to trusting parents and trusting parents to deal with other parents and other family members, and we don't do enough of that.
Okay, Sue?
Yes, I don't know what I can add to that really. I think the issue about compulsion is a tricky one. I don't think that these things are optional for some people. And if you look at the debates in the States where the African-American, the fact that African-American people are so overrepresented in areas of social deprivation, these debates are much more politicised. And the people who get the surveillance, the people who don't get to choose, are the people who have the fewest resources. And I mean, I can't go into Heckman now, but people really need to read the Heckman equation and the maths behind it properly, because there are all sorts of embedded assumptions in that. And one of those is that you don't alleviate poverty with giving people more money. You alleviate poverty by changing their parenting practices.
Okay, Jan.
Okay. You don't need compulsion if you convince people that they're inadequate, because they will become help-seeking citizens. That's the aim of policy. They don't want to compel people. They want us all to think that we just need help. We need to go to the equivalent of the gym. We don't. We are doing a really good job of raising children in this country. Some people are really struggling, and then some children die. The same number as actually has died probably pretty much throughout the 20th century. We are doing yes, it's falling. We're doing a really good job. Nobody ever says that. Please tell us that. That would really be quite helpful to parents. Secondly, I'm not trying to sell a book. It's 45 quid. We're not going to sell very many. It's very small. What we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to get the argument out there, because it's really, really important. And I would like neuroscientists to get involved in that and to say this is not true. You're relying on neurobollocks. And I would like politicians to be much more open to actually their real beliefs, which is that they do think the family is important, and they do think that parents need to be autonomous, and that privacy is important. And that side of the argument, which is based on human experience, common sense, is the one that needs to come to the fore, and we need to tell the evidence-based lot to shut up for a while.
Okay, thank you very much.